Hello everybody. I know it's been a while since I've actually done a video of my own, but here you go. So I want to split this up into three parts. I don't know if you guys would really watch a full hour video by me. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do the three videos in like 3 days. So basically I'm going to do part 1 of this, part 2, and then part 3. I'm going to post the transcripts up on my Facebook profile, and we'll see how this goes. Each part will basically be 20 minutes each. Which adds up to basically an hour. And if you're not interested in the topic, then you'll know within the first video instead of, listening the whole way through and finding out, or, whatever. But it just might be more helpful to do this in that way. So I'm going to be reading from a script in this one. So why don't we get started? So this video is called On Video Methodology and Anti-Intellectualism, part 1 of 3. So last time, well, originally when I wrote the script, last time was actually last time, but last time is now the response that I made to Lengthen Your Norther about left libertarianism. I defended the ascetic principle, and well, I'm a bit disappointed in myself. I don't think it was horrible or anything, but I really should have done more research, besides the wiki article and a few anecdotes and examples that I already had in mind, and try to discern what I did and didn't believe and why and so on and blah blah blah. It was this lack of intellectual rigor in my previous video that really led me to just taking Green Ghost 2008 at his own word instead of really researching for myself what the ascetic principle meant. Now that said, I do think a lot of the principles and ideas that come along with the idea of asceticism are actually defendable in their own right, and I think a lot of the things I said in that video I still stand behind. And perhaps that's really what I should have said instead of trying to defend asceticism in general. Such examples of those ideas I defend on their own merits are suspicion of modern industry or pleasures, a simpler lifestyle, focusing more on self-improvement through your own values instead of the values pushed onto you by society, probably some others too. But all that stuff that I'm talking about right there brings me to what I want to talk about for the majority of this video and the other two, which is anti-intellectualism, and intellectualism in general, and so on. I want to discuss what it is meant by intellectuals, and what is meant by being against such a concept. Some illustrative examples of these things in practice, both past and present, and try to see if we can come up with some plausible conclusions, or even answers, or dare I say, solutions to these issues. Now, I in no way claim that just because this video is a lot more intellectually rigorous, that it will be somehow a lot better or even perfect or whatever. So I just want to get that out of the way. I don't know how good this video will be. I think it will turn out pretty well, but we'll see. So the reason for doing all this in a much more methodically intellectual way, kind of ironic because we're talking about anti-intellectualism, is it stems from my last video and how disorganized it probably was in comparison to how it could have been. So I'd like to see if I can at least do as well as I did in the last video, if not a lot better. So let's just see how that goes. The first section of this presentation that I want to give to you guys is called The Genus of Intellectuals, Intellectualism and the Opposition. First off, one of the most important things for me to do, in my opinion, is to set the stage by defining my terms. So first off, what's meant by an intellectual? Well, in The Campus War, American philosopher and current professor of philosophy in the University of California, John R. Searle, and that's how I'm going to be pronouncing his name, I don't know if that's correct, talks about the battlegrounds of the 1960s and 70s between the yuppies and hippies, yuppies in the establishment, hippies in the establishment, and everything in between. He writes that, quote, intellectuals by definition are people who take ideas seriously for their own sake. Whether or not a theory is true or false is important to them independently of any practical applications it may have. Furthermore, Thomas Sowell, author of Intellectuals and Society, simply described intellectuals as peoples whose end products are ideas. Now, the first thing that may pop out from these working definitions, and they're basically the definitions I'll be using for the remainder of the video, roughly around there, maybe with some variations here and there, but mostly within those limits, is that there's this line between what is useful and what is simply pleasurable for the intellectual. The sort of person who finds learning and creating and dealing with ideas good in of themselves is the sort of person we want to deal with in these videos, or that I will be talking about. Now, suffice to say that the engineer who you may have working on some machinery of yours is probably not the person we're dealing with. That is because the sorts of ideas they're working with aren't towards just dealing with the ideas in of themselves, but actually towards a tangible and, more importantly, physically obtainable goal. In this instance, the engineer needs to fix or improve what you've given them so they can get paid. Now, of course, this is a linear way of looking at things, because, for instance, there may be a part of the engineer who just enjoys dealing with these things just to deal with them and see what happens. Certainly, that has some intellectual type connotations, I won't deny that, but overall, of course, the engineer is much more connected to the end than the means. Now, this can seem puzzling for us if we're not careful in our analysis. Why would the intellectual not be connected to the practical world? If they only have one real goal or thing they want to accomplish and are constantly working around its parameters, then why is nothing accomplished in the realm of practicality? To answer this, we must return to what the intellectual is. A person who values ideas for their own sake regardless of the consequences. Maybe consequences isn't the best word, maybe practical considerations. They don't see the ends as needed to benefit others or even themselves in any tangible or physical way, and might just be just as happy with just thinking about these ideas and wondering where they could go. The intellectual then is a bit of a romantic, ideologically speaking, and of course a contemplator. But is this necessarily a bad thing? Well, purely based on the principles and ideas we've talked about, let's explore that idea. We'll come to particular applications of intellectuals as we go along, but for right now I just want to focus on some of my own ideas on this matter. First I must defend the intellectual. Some positive things about them and their role in society. For one thing, it seems like there are plenty of people who have some sort of role in society, and perhaps for the intellectual this is being the dreamer, or one filled with hope in what we can achieve as human beings, with the ideas that we can contemplate. I don't think I'll have to go out on much of a limb to say there's at least some place for such a person in any society, regardless of what philosophy you have. They, of course, give all the more time to the people who don't have the time to deal with these ideas for their own sake. The sort of people I'm talking about are people who must toil and sweat and feel the heart-blazing sun whip their working backs into shape. They have no time to think of why the process they are going in really matters. So the intellectual, therefore, may provide some legroom for the common man to have a bit of an excuse in not really thinking after a hard day of work under the hot beating sun. Now, whether that's a good thing or not, I'm not going to actually examine, but it is a question I'm certainly willing to examine in the comments section or in video responses and so on. Another thing is that contemplating for contemplation's sake, while it may not be the useful thing in the short run, probably has big long-term results. This is especially true if the intellectual in question actually has a bit of influence and power over the society around them. This can come from past intellectual prowess being shown to the surrounding community or communities, and them then being hailed as one of the best examples of the community's values and so on. From there, they might actually be able to influence the ideas of others within the community through policy crafting and constant dialogue and so on. But there is a problem with this. The flip side of that, however, is a sort of intelligence worship, or communities entirely built around certain concepts or truths in the universe that the intellectual merely says are true. This, of course, can lead to petty tyrants who in the end just have a slightly bigger brain, or at least according to them they do, than the rest of the people. Upon the throne, the intellectual can stand above the rest of the people and not only shift policy, but start dictating it, and on a supposedly higher plane than most people can understand. They use their tools of jargon and big words and try explaining really complicated phenomena and pass that off as big scientific achievements and so on. Sorry if the camera's moving about. I'm trying to make sure it doesn't, but it's easily shakeable. So sorry about that. So this is one of the main tools of what I'd like to call the vulgar intellectual. Hat tip to Kevin Carson for the original term vulgar libertarian, upon which I drew inspiration from in coming up with this term. These vulgar intellectuals use their intellect not only for primarily practical means, under the guise of using it for the sake of ideas themselves, but do so in clearly harmful ways. A good example of such a state of intelligentsia is the same kind that the Mormon Church uses. Now, you can't go on the Wikipedia page for anti-intellectualism without seeing at the bottom, if you are looking at the bottom, a whole bunch of quotes from the Mormon Church about how an anti-intellectual sort of mindset can boost the spirit or general spirituality of somebody. Now that just to me means they just want more control over the people that go to the church, and they don't want actually thinking people. They just want less intellectual thinking people, obedient basically. But it could be wrong. If somebody knows better than I do, and I certainly didn't do my big research on religion and anti-intellectualism, and certainly not specifically Mormonism. I'm only saying this because I know a little bit about Mormonism. I read a little bit about it in college, was really disgusted with it actually, in some ways. It is interesting, the history of it is somewhat interesting, but overall I definitely am pretty suspicious of religion using anti-intellectualism. But a more widely seen example on the wiki page is the court intellectuals, as Samuel Edward Conklin III, an agorist or free market anarchist, called them, of the authoritarian states actually using the idea of anti-intellectualism to have the intellectuals who oppose them killed. That's probably one of the nastiest sorts of vulgar intellectualism. I'm not sure how you can get much worse than that. So, of course, intellectuals don't need to be vulgar to be bad intellectuals, or to think about bad ideas, or to contemplate them poorly, or to be, nor does a good intellectual, someone who's good at abstracting and contemplating ideas and doing so for their own sake, necessarily be a vulgar one, or necessarily not be a vulgar one, or whatever. The connection here is the one of intent, focus, and resolve, as with most things. It heavily depends on where the person who sees the intellectual is coming from, of course, but what the intellectual intends to do with their own ideas, or what ideas they're contemplating, is also very important. Some ideas, for example, such as unrequited love or past failures and so on, if constantly contemplated for their own sake, can lead to a barrage of self-ruinous proposals further down the line. So being a good intellectual heavily depends on what goals and intents the outside person has, as well as the intellectual themselves. This is just the same for just about any other sort of role, but it's especially important for the intellectual because their actions are so confined within a particular field of activity. It is even the more so applicable here. Now, the good intellectual, I'd suggest, is the one who puts their time and energy not just to contemplation for its own sake, but for its own ends, and does it with a particular care for the sort of environment their ideas will reach. For instance, a case of this, an example of this not being the case, is the leading scholar or thinker in the way that organisms in the ocean have evolved throughout the many years the planet has existed, mentioning some, tangential research or data about how the environment has gotten warmer over recent years, and thus they've developed differently, or something like this. Now, the environmental readings may or may not actually be correct, but it can lead to a whole sort of other conversation about the possibilities of global warming that were perhaps never intended by the original author. Now, this could be a positive or a negative thing, not always a negative thing, depending on results and how the evidence is considered, but oftentimes these sort of things can be non-precisely considered and put in line with the scientists who do believe in global warming or don't, their own self-absorbed goals. But then, of course, the intellectual has, for all intents and purposes, left the building, and we're more dealing with the vulgar intellectual anyways, and often the court intellectual as well. So discussing the positives, negatives, and some of the possible intricacies of intellectuals themselves is one thing, but what would an anti-intellectualism look like? Well, I believe there are actually a few sorts of anti-intellectuals in the world, and some are more, intelligent than others. One form of anti-intellectualism is a sort of reduction of the intelligence, or an opposition to intelligence at its base. Here we have individuals who just think long-term planning is an ill in of itself, that a contemplation of ideas for its own sake is useless in all cases and thus abstracts away from their goals. You typically see this in leftist groups or protest groups in which waving signs and yelling slogans over and over again are the preferred means of talking instead of, quote, loud and abstract ideas that the populace, apparently, according to them, doesn't understand. Now, to be fair, they have a point, sort of. Usually protests aren't so much about the content. I know that sounds bad, but try to bear with me. And more about the look of it. I think that was actually one of the great things about the Occupy Wall Street protests, is because for all of its faults, it did actually have quite a bit of substance to it in the form of direct democracy and consensus decision-making. Or maybe those are the two same things, but whatever. As well as speeches and constant dialogue among the people there on theory and action. And they had slogans and they had signs. I mean, they just had a lot of different action going on. Now, that's not to say it all went well just because of that. It didn't, obviously. But it's a pretty good, or at least a better model, than what the people who are against an abstraction of any sort are suggesting. Now, the sort of anti-intellectualism I think is better, is something, obviously, I find a little bit more healthy. Thomas Sowell writes against intellectuals himself by stating, quote, by encouraging or even requiring students to take stands where they have neither the knowledge nor the intellectual training to seriously examine complex issues, teachers promote the expression of unsubstantiated opinions, the venting of uninformed emotions, and the habit of acting on those opinions and emotions while ignoring or dismissing opposing views, without having either the intellectual equipment or the personal experience to weigh one view against another in any serious way. You can find that quote on the Wikipedia page for Intellectuals in Society, and I'll be linking that in the description. And there's certainly a harm in going out of your own area of expertise and trying to offer advice, and certainly a sort of anti-intellectualism in the sense of when intellectual prowess is misused for power grabs or tried to be used when it's not appropriate, is a skepticism obviously worth having. But besides that, is the skepticism of intellectuals in general worth having? Well, I'd say so. I'd like to illustrate one defense of anti-intellectualism I've actually already given, and I gave it on Facebook in response to a status message by one of my friends. He wrote, quote, "The charge of hair-splitting has always been one of the weapons in the arsenal of the anti-intellectual. One root of anti-intellectualism is a churlish hatred of all refinement. Another is laziness. Thinking is hard work. One has to be careful, one has to be precise, one has to carve the bird of reality at the joints. It is no surprise that people don't like thinking. It goes against our slothful grain. But surely any serious thinking about any topic issues in the making of distinctions that to the untutored may seem strained and unnecessary. The truth of the matter is that there are very few occasions on which the charge of hair-splitting is justly made. On almost all occasions, the accuser is simply advertising his inability to grasp a distinction that the subject matter requires. He is parading before us his lack of culture and mental acuity and his churlish refusal to be instructed." End quote. My response was this, and it didn't actually get a response itself, so this will be it for the conversation. Plus, I don't want to weigh down you guys too much in this one conversation. So I said, I think more people should hear out the anti-intellectual more than they do. Yes, distinctions are important, but sometimes people only want a simple yes or no answer and then can actually do fine on their own, and then if they can't, they'll just ask for further assistance. There's no need to bore the common man with 20 minutes of distinctions and such if they don't need those distinctions to accomplish what you want them to accomplish to begin with. And this actually makes the so-called intellectual the hair splitter, precisely because they are creating distinctions so fine and unnecessary to achieving the necessary goals that it becomes overly informative, and I'd add now, probably pretty bureaucratic. It also creates a sort of atmosphere in which one must eventually shut down their brain just to keep listening to the person go on about the complexity of the work when they already know what to do. In an ironic twist, then, the intellectual is capable of creating a very non-intellectual type environment in which people are much more accustomed to shutting off their minds than keeping them on to solve problems. None of this is to say that the intellectual is always useless, or even a majority of the time for that matter, but just to give the anti-intellectual a bit more credit than just waving your hand off and saying they're just lazy, or whatever. After all, you just might find out that you, the anti-intellectual, are the one who's actually promoting laziness in the end, and not the anti-intellectual. So that's what I said. To wrap up this section, I just want to say, sure, I don't think the charge of using anti-intellectualism, using it as a sort of slothishness is an unjustified response. Some people do actually fly under the banner of anti-intellectualism or fall under it as this. But it's certainly a less nuanced one than I'd like to see. It's certainly a less nuanced response to anti-intellectualism that I'd like to see. And that's really what I'm calling for. Not necessarily completely positive or completely negative, but a more nuanced opinion on it. I do try to have a little bit more positive than negative, but overall I'm trying to be nuanced about it. I certainly don't think people who don't even support the use of dialogue or abstract into even mildly higher level of discourses are something to be supported or a basis of strategy to be used in protest. Nonetheless, as I made obvious, I do think there's something to the common man and his plights and what have you. So I'm trying to sketch out a more nuanced opinion on both intellectuals and anti-intellectuals, and I hope as we go along in this video, and the videos to come, I can make solid enough distinctions everywhere in between to make this a useful guide for those concepts. So that's my introduction of sorts. Hope you like it. I'll be uploading the second part tomorrow and the third part on Tuesday. I just don't feel like I should overload you guys with one 1-hour video. I might get less views, but at least you will know whether you actually want to keep listening or not. Up next, I'll be talking about I'll basically be talking about anti-intellectuals in action. I'll be talking about, I just want to give you a little bit of a preview. I'll be talking about Anti-Intellectuals in Action, and also Campus War by Searle again. I'll be talking about that. And then in the third part, I'll be talking about anti-intellectual action will be taken, left anti-intellectualism and its discontents, and then I'll be doing a conclusion of sorts. So that will be the third part, and there you go. I hope you guys enjoyed this first part. More to come soon.